Welcome to Lolli&Lizzi. I am Lolli.
I'm Lizzie. Today we're going to talk about the poor widow. She's come up in a couple subjects, and I just wanted to go through just some things that stood out to us. I mean, within the subjects, but I'm going to bring up something else toward the end. So.
Well, everything else she was brought up as a side character, like a sidebar.
So
this is focused 100% on the widow.
So we are talking about the widow, and specifically, it's about all widows, but the main point of this one is to talk about the one in Luke. And it's in Luke 20, and it starts in Luke 20 to verse 46 and 47, which is at the very end of that chapter. But it continues on, the same story continues on in Luke 21, 1 through 4. So that's what I'm fixing to read to you. Beware of the scribes who desire to go around in long robes, love greetings in the marketplaces, the best seats in the synagogues, and the best places at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation. And he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw also a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites. So he said, Truly, I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all. For all these out of their abundance have put in offerings for God, but she out of her poverty put in all the livelihood that she had. And my question today is, why is this widow putting in all the livelihood that she had?
Right.
Okay? And so some may try and tell you that it was the tithe. And we have already established when we went over the tithe that the tithe is food. Okay, and so we prove that because in Deuteronomy, it tells you pretty much, Deuteronomy 14 is like a perfect chapter because it goes through a lot about the tithe. If you had a question about it, it kind of all seems to be concentrated in there. Deuteronomy 14:22, it says, You shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year. So once a year, each year, they give a tithe to the temple of grain or whatever food. I'm thinking it doesn't matter what food, but in that part it says grain. It says, And you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to place his name. So I'm assuming this is the temple or one of their synagogues.
Right.
Okay, so then you have another tithe. In 14:28, it says, At the end of every 3rd year, you shall bring out of the tithe of your produce of that year and store it within your gates. And that tithe, so you're going to bring it every 3rd year and you're going to store it within, when they say in your gates, I'm assuming this is their town.
Right.
And so in verse 23, now this is telling you what a tithe is. The tithe of your grain and your new wine and your oil, of the firstborn of your herds, of your flock, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. And then who is this one for? What's within your gates every 3rd year, it says, this is for the Levite, because he has no portion nor inheritance with you, and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates may come and eat and be satisfied, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the works of your hand which you do. And I chopped that up because it's a long passage, but I'm trying to make a quick reference to what the tithe is. It's always food and who it was for, and where it goes.
Right.
So I'm just trying to establish that. So just that right there tells you that if she is at the treasury and not a storehouse, if she's at a treasury giving coins, 2 mites, this could not be a tithe. So that answers that. Some may also try and go into, because there's a temple tax mentioned. The people who collect the temple tax come and they question Peter, does Jesus pay a temple tax? And so when you look into what a temple tax is, so I mean there is a tax, and it is God ordained, it's biblical. It was in Exodus 30, 11 through 13. And I'll just read those real quick. Then again, this is something else we brought up before, but I'm just trying to reel in these questions. Okay, so Exodus 30, 11 through 13. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, when you take the census of the children of Israel for their number, then every man shall give a ransom for himself to the Lord when you number them, that there may be no plague among them when you number them. This is what everyone among those who are numbered shall give, half a shekel according to the shekel of the sanctuary. Everyone included among those who are numbered from 20 years old and above shall give an offering to the Lord. And so the temple tax is for the upkeep of the temple. And then when we looked up the word right there where it says every man, it literally means every man. It says this word is translated in Exodus as every man, and this means male or husband specifically. Yeah. So it's never feminine. It's never used in a feminine sense. This word in Hebrew only means men, male, husband. Right. And so when it kept talking about those that are numbered, I got to thinking about it, and I've talked about this before, but in Matthew, when he fed the loaves and fishes to the multitude, he said it says in the Bible that there was 5,000 plus women and children.
Right.
And so it looks like when they count heads, they're counting heads of the house. The male heads. And if you're outside of that household, you're age 20, you're covered. You're called to pay the temple tax also.
Right. So once you reach the age of 20, you become accountable for yourself to pay the temple tax. Mm-hmm. But the female is either under her father or her husband.
Correct.
She falls under one of those males. The female is not counted. Mm-hmm. It's just men.
No, that's fine.
Well, I was going to say something else, and I thought I was jumping ahead of you, so go ahead.
Okay, so, and to go further with that, when we studied the covenant, one of the books that we looked at was The Blood Covenant by E.W. Kenyon. And within that, on page 31, he brings up, if the child's father and mother should die, another Israelite was under obligation to care for that child. Or if the husband should die, to care for the widow. It is the law of the covenant. So, a widow, for one thing, a widow is a woman, and she's never called, God has never put that command on a woman to pay that temple tax.
Right.
And even if her husband did, if her husband died, we are already seeing that the Israelites were called to take care of their widows with food.
On the tithe part, it says every third year that is for the widow, the homeless, and the stranger.
Right.
And so the widow is being fed by the temple and
the
gates.
At the gates of their town or whatever their gates mean.
And so
I'm thinking each town will have
the point
gates.
is the widow is supposed to be taken care of by the community.
Basically. And she was never called to pay a temple tax.
As a female, she's not required to pay a temple tax.
So then you can even look at it further when we're talking about women in general, that in a blood covenant, it was the man, in the Abrahamic covenant, it was the man that he was called, all the men were to be circumcised. So that the men was required to
cut the blood,
to bring blood to the altar.
Yeah.
Not the woman.
Right.
And so again, it's just further showing that the woman, when it comes to stuff like this, had no requirements.
Right. In the Old Testament, the woman had no requirements. The men were under the more weighty laws. I mean, the women gave birth and nurtured and raised children, done all this. But when it come to the temple and to honor the covenant, the women fell up underneath their father or their husband.
Right.
So that's we're making that point. We're leading up to something.
Yeah, as I say, it's just proving that something like a temple tax, the widow wouldn't have been paying it. But even to go deeper on that, so the woman is covered by the circumcision of either her father first and then her husband.
Right.
So if you look at creation, it says that Genesis 2:24, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh, which proves he's covering things, but now they're one, and she's covered through her husband because they are one flesh.
Yes.
And if you look at even in marriage, okay, he says the man will leave, not the woman. The man leaves father and mother and cleaves to his wife. But when he leaves, what does he do? He goes, and even in our traditions, and I believe these are biblical, he asks the father for her hand.
Right. Yes.
So the father's covering is being handed over to the husband.
Right.
And then at the wedding, they become one flesh. So there's no way so far that those two mites represent tithe or temple tax.
Right.
Okay? That's what I'm trying to get to so far. Now, this last thing, now in the churches I go to, they will push that this was a faith, an act of faith. That she gave all she had, that she was trusting God, I guess, to bring back that 100-fold. And so, is this a step of faith? Okay, so when he saw her put in the two mites, did Jesus marvel? When Jesus saw a great step of faith, it said he marveled.
Right.
Or he would also say things like, he would have went to her and said, daughter, as you believe, be it unto you.
Right.
Or did he announce, I haven't seen such great faith in all Israel. Did he mention faith at all?
No.
He did not mention faith at all.
No.
So, what I want to do is look at the past record of some people. And so, first of all, you've got in the Old Testament, and this is some scriptures we brought up before, but Israel, Isaiah 10:1-2, it says, woe to those who decree unrighteous decrees, who write misfortune, which they have prescribed, to rob the needy of justice, and to take what is right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. Now that word decree there means issued by rulers, written commands having the effect of law. They're not biblical laws written by God. These are decrees written by men.
Right.
And then in Malachi 3:5, it says that Jesus is going to deal with those who exploit wage earners and widows and orphans. And the word exploit, when you've been exploited, the synonyms for exploited is abused, overburdened, overworked, oppressed, milked, and taken advantage of. So this is what the Lord is saying that they're doing in the Old Testament. So let me explain what a scribe and a Pharisee is, because I really didn't know. I had a general idea about who they were, but I think this says a lot. So scribes and Pharisees, and this is from Britannica.com, it says, in the first century, scribes and Pharisees were two largely distinct groups. That presumably some scribes were Pharisees. Scribes had knowledge of the law and could draft legal documents. contracts for marriage, divorce, loans, inheritance, mortgages, the sale of land, and the like. Every village had at least one scribe. Pharisees were members of a party that believed in the resurrection and in following legal traditions that were ascribed not to the Bible, but to the traditions of the fathers, or like I'd say, traditions of men.
It's exactly what it is.
Like the scribes, they were also well-known legal experts, hence the partial overlap of membership of the two groups. It appears from subsequent rabbinic traditions, however, that most Pharisees were small landowners and traders, but not professional scribes. So these people, they're business owners, they're landowners, they're in trade. They also know all the laws, and the scribes are actually writing decrees or laws per se.
Right.
And so, and if they're writing about what you're buying and selling, they know everything your household's worth when your husband dies. And the Lord's saying they're writing unrighteous decrees to rob them. Mm-hmm. So basically, the man's worked his whole life to provide for his family, and when he dies, they have done wrote decrees to come in and rob them of everything.
Yeah.
So, what's the New Testament church doing? Because that's Old Testament so far. I've read you Malachi and Isaiah. Okay, so in the New Testament, Matthew 23:14 says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you devour widows' houses." Mark 12:38 through 40 says, "Beware of the scribes who devour widows' houses." Now, I didn't read the whole thing, and just the parts that's in there.
Yeah.
It's just showing that he's talking about these scribes and Pharisees, and they're devouring the widows' houses. He's talking about them in Matthew and Mark. So, this word devour, I mean, I think everybody knows pretty much what devour is, but it just says more to me when you read the actual definition. It's like to eat up greedily.
There you go.
To destroy, consume, or waste. A poor widow sounds like she's wasting away in poverty and lack.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to read this again. So in Luke 20:46, well, I'm not going to read all of it. The one I started off with, in Luke 20, he says, "Beware of the scribes who devour widows' houses." They're still doing it.
Yeah.
They're still doing it.
Right.
And then he looks up and he says,
that's the part people miss.
Yeah, then he looks up, and I think it's funny that they separated those into chapters right there where the point is being made.
Right, because he knows sooner, it says, who devour the widow's houses and for the pretense make long prayers, these will receive greater condemnation. And it immediately says, and he looked up.
Right.
And saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury, and he saw also a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites. Immediately after he says that, and if we don't know anything else about Jesus, he tells parables and shows examples.
Yeah, and
so
he
looks
an
up.
Example.
Yeah, he looks up, and so he said, and he goes on to say, I don't want to say anything. Okay.
I'm good.
Okay, so he said, "Truly I say to you," he's talking to the disciples, "that this poor widow has put in more than all, for all these out of their abundance have put in offerings for God. But she, out of her poverty, put in all the livelihood that she had." All the livelihood that she had. He just said, just a few verses up, who devour the widows.
And in Malachi, he's prophesying of the coming Messiah in the passage where he says that. Where he says he's coming and he's going to be against those who would devour the widows' houses.
Yeah, it says that he's coming and he's against it. And right here he's saying.
Right here he's here on earth and he's against it.
I just got finished talking about how they're going to devour the widows. And now I'm looking over here. Do you see this? Do you see this, Peter? You know, he's talking to Peter and John. Do you see all this disciples?
Yeah, he was.
This is what I'm talking about.
To his disciples,
they're devouring her. They've taken her last 2 coins. She's put in her whole livelihood. She's given out of her, her poverty. Mm-hmm. They've decreed her to nothing, to nothingness. And he's wanting them to look, he's getting their attention to look over there. So
this is not an act of faith.
This is not an act of faith.
And it really
and nowhere in this entire scripture
that people use it.
Yeah, nowhere in this entire scripture does it ever say. It's like she was saying. Nowhere does it say, he marveled. Or did he say, no greater faith have I seen in all Israel? Or did he go up and lay his hand on and said, sister, you're getting 100-fold for all that you've done for the work.
Did he stop by and tell Judas, when you go out to feed the poor, when you go out to give to the poor tonight, make sure the widow gets at least 100-fold.
Yeah, he doesn't say any of that.
She needs to get a 100-fold return.
He
don't mention it, and so they fill it in. The church will take that passage and say, the Lord's watching, you give your tithe, or what you're giving in, and he's watching, and sometimes you got to give till it hurts.
That is such a cross.
That's a step of faith. That's what she's doing, a step of faith. And yes, there are steps of faith. And yes, sometimes God does speak to you.
Yeah.
Because we're led by the Spirit. And he may test you in your faith and say, give this amount. And it's more than you feel comfortable giving, but he's saying, do you trust me? He will do that. But
not under a law. It's not
to give all the
anywhere.
livelihood that you have, that don't happen very often. And then that person knows within themselves, I really believe God's wanting me to do this, and I'm going to do that. I don't like this being used as like this is a normal thing, and telling people to give their tithes before anything else.
I don't care if your electric's getting ready to be shut off. And you get that
we
tithe.
Also need money for the building fund and the speaker that's here today. And if you have a need, a financial need, and so I'm all about giving.
Yes.
And I do believe God will bless you, whether you're given in finances or whatever you give where you're led to give. I do believe in supporting the church. Absolutely. Sitting at a church every Sunday and you're not helping out in any way, not even financially, I think that's wrong. You should be willing to give something. But you got to look within yourself and say, Lord, what do you need me to give? What do you want me to give? Because I want to please you. And I believe that church would flourish without that burden. Because I have been that person who's living paycheck to paycheck. And you're sitting there and you feel guilty because you gave your tithe. Well, now you really like the speaker and you feel like, I need to give it. And of course they're putting the pressure on. So you try and scrape up a few dollars for them. And then, it's just like it compounds on you and it just becomes a heavy weight. And so I don't like that they're using this widow as an act of faith when this is showing what you're probably doing to your members at your church. Anyway, just being that person that was crying out, needing to pay my bills, and then finding out, you go online and you'll hear stories of people losing their homes and stuff because they refuse to not pay their tithe because they think they're going to be under a curse. And anyway, this is just one more example where I think they're using this woman's hideous situation, and instead of calling out that these are supposed to be leaders of God's temple, these are leaders of the the Sanhedrin. these people are burdened. I mean, these people in this time was already burdened by Romans.
Right.
The Romans were coming in and taxing to death. And on top of that, you got scribes wanting their part.
Right.
So, and Pharisees. So I just, I wanted to bring that out and just.
Well, within what you said, I mean, we could spiral off into, numerous things, because we're to walk by faith, and it doesn't take any faith to do what someone is commanding you to do. It also, it's just like she says, you're sitting there feeling guilty. Well, that's a form of condemnation, and we're not supposed to be under any condemnation. So says Romans 8:1.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, you live in fear because they'll tell you if you don't tithe and you don't, pay your dues, then, you're under the curse. Well, my Bible says that I don't live under the curse because Jesus was, sacrificed on a tree, and the person who sacrificed on a tree becomes a curse, and he became a curse for us. So, and then on top of that, you sit in fear, waiting for the hand of God to wallop you one because, you're not abiding by the law. And, my Bible says that perfect love casts out all fear, and God's perfect love. So I've been put under condemnation, I've been put under the curse, and I've been put under fear, and none of that.
And then they'll say, walk by faith.
Yeah, walk by faith. None of that is a walk of a Christian. I mean, it's so obvious that it's painful to watch. And, and the truth of the matter is, the same people that are teaching this, I have very high regard and respect for in other areas. They're great men of God. I can't even put a teaspoon of what I've done for the kingdom compared to what they've done as far as winning souls.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. I believe these people are delusional.
These are great men of God as far
Not delusional,
but I think they have just learned to parrot what the generation before them said.
I don't. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. There's no anger. Deep dive. There's no I still love and would go to these churches that do this because I don't for a second
think it's on purpose.
They're doing it on purpose.
Because
they taught it for years, and I believed it and agreed with it and would have.
I was one of the ones parroting.
Yeah, I was parroting too.
And then we start trying to figure out why it's not working, why we're not living above and beyond the means, because if you tithe and do all the right things, then you're supposed to be living in the abundance.
Mm-hmm.
And when I wasn't living in the abundance, I was like, okay, it's not God that's wrong, it's got to be me. So I'm not doing something right.
Right.
And so we started digging, and we're like, what? I mean, we were dumbfounded. Our mouths were gaped open.
And it makes you mad. It's a righteous anger because I feel like we've been duped. We've lost out. It started off being I think it started off with the Romans, and of course the Jewish people still stayed with the ones that didn't accept Christ. They did still walk in these things.
What was it? 300 years.
Yeah.
300 years the church did not pay tithes. The Roman Catholic Church brought it back into existence. And even then, when they brought it back, it was still food and cattle. And then it wasn't until
like 600 years later that they flipped it to actually
it was
currency.
The Pope Pope Innocent. His name was Innocent.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, talking about a pun.
I looked this stuff up last night, and I don't know if you're interested or not, but I never understood where things sit. Like, the priest, they basically, all the priests were to do was to keep up the temple. That their main thing was the sacrifice and literally keeping up the temple itself. Each of them was given tasks to keep up with certain equipment or certain things like the pillars and the columns or whatever. And so that was the priest's job. And then I was like, so what is the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin is basically the Supreme Court of Israel, and there's 70 members, and it's kind of like ours. There's 70 members in the Supreme Court of Israel, the Sanhedrin, and within them you have the Pharisees and Sadducees. So they're literally, it's described as political religious parties. So there's two parties, like we got
here in the United
Republican
States.
and Democrat.
Right.
And of course the Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection, and they didn't believe in an afterlife. The Pharisees believed in resurrection, and they also believed that there was an afterlife. I was surprised to realize that. I knew they didn't believe in the resurrection, but I did not know the Sadducees didn't believe that in an afterlife.
Yeah, that was one of their big things.
So apparently they didn't believe in hell either. No,
they just believe you died and you become non-existent.
Okay. So, and then the scribes, I was describing them earlier. They started off, they basically just transcribed, they just wrote. They'd make copies of all the scrolls or whatever they needed copies of. But because they wrote and read the word so much, they've started being seen as very wise men. And then it got to a point, because they started writing these decrees and stuff. So people started elevating them to a point where they had a lot of prestige. But this one particular, I was actually watching this guy on a video, and he was saying they got to a point where they were actually annoying because they knew the law, and so they was always judging everybody.
Yeah.
You're not, that's not law. You're not obeying the law.
Yeah.
So
they could put everybody under condemnation and guilt.
Just some information there if that was something you wondered about, because I'd hear the Sanhedrin and I'd think, well, what exactly is a Sanhedrin? If you've got the temple and the priest, what's a Sanhedrin? But that's more, I guess, to enforce the law. It's their court.
Right. Yes. So
anyway,
I think that's all for today.
Yeah. So we will see you next week.
We will.
Bye, everybody.